Allyson, welcome to the podcast, and many, many thanks for volunteering to do a presentation on punctuation. I'm really grateful for that. In my introduction to you and your work, I referenced what you had written in your poet's biography in the Poetry P website. You said that after your MFA in poetry in 2018, you dove into haiku as a means of creative recovery. Now, I've noticed that a haiku are really useful when you're in physical or mental pain, but I don't think that's what you were referring to. Can you tell us a little bit about what you meant?
Absolutely. And haiku really actually, like, it's one of those things that I would come to and then drift away from and come to and drift away from. And then after my MFA, it really did seem to just stick. And I think part of it is, I don't want to demonize the whole MFA program culture, because I know a lot of people have loved their experience. They've been really helped by it. I was not. It really, the pressure to produce ended up not being good for me. I've actually weirdly I've always been a self-motivated person, but then being in a thing where for 3 years you just have to do it on someone else's timetable, that was not good for me. I was also just in a program that ultimately ended up not being in a good fit at all. And I stuck with it because you'd already thrown in time and money. And I was after that MFA for career reasons. And then it ended up just burning me out, totally burning me out. I didn't write anything for a long time except haiku, because I had a friend, I had done an online MFA, and I had a friend in that program who lived in Japan, and actually one of his haiku is part of my presentation. And when I was a year ahead of him, and when I realized, oh, we're not gonna have any classes together anymore, I said, well, do you wanna just do a haiku exchange every week? And he said yes. And we're not as diligent about it as we said we'd be, but we're pretty diligent about it. So we've been sending each other an original haiku more or less every week for a long time, like 7 years, 6 or 7 years now. And so for a while I'd be like, I'm not writing. And I was like, no way, I'm writing haiku. I'm sending a haiku every week, even if it's terrible, even if I think it's the worst thing I've ever written, I'm sending it to my friend because I said I would. And so a haiku was the one thing that kept me going as a writer. And then the more I wrote haiku, and my friend Warren would send me haiku, and I just kept falling deeper in love with it. And then I joined Haiku Society of America, and a bunch of my poet friends were deep in haiku. I joined the Austin Haiku Study Group, and from there it just took off. And there's something about, I think, for better or for worse, at least for now, haiku exists outside of the standard, what people call the po-biz, or the poetry business, or the, really academic approach to poetry. Certainly there are some, academics who write haiku. And it was very funny, in 2015, there was a piece in Frog Pond about how we need to get haiku more mainstream. And I was like, I don't know, I kind of like the fact that it's not. And like, there's none of this pressure of, you get to put haiku on your CV, and you get fellowships in haiku. I'm like, I kind of love that it's just, I still write poetry, but I'm free of all of that baggage, basically.
You've touched on so many interesting things there. I mean, as we talked about doing this presentation today, you've already given me one extra topic to do, monoku and punctuation. And then from what you've said, it's so true. I'm having a bit of a writer's block at the moment, but I write haiku, and I make sure they're all terrible at the moment, but I keep writing because eventually some little spark will happen, and haiku are just super for that, to keep you ticking over. Anyway, today's not about my writer's block. It's about your presentation. And punctuation has fascinated me for a while now. And because we've worked, you've sent me the presentation beforehand, I know it's going to be a super one. So I'm going to hand over to you, and I will see you at the end.
All right. So I am here today to talk about punctuation in haiku, which I know can be a pretty loaded topic for a lot of us haiku people. The reason I wanted to do this workshop is I wanted to show how contemporary English language haiku poets use punctuation, and help you decide whether you want to use punctuation in your haiku and when to do so. I'm not an all or nothing person. You don't have to reject it. You don't have to use it. I think it varies on a poem by poem basis. And I want you at the end of this to feel confident that if you want to add punctuation to your haiku toolbox, you could. And I do want to clarify today, I'm focusing primarily on 3-line haiku. We did talk a little bit about monoku, but again, I'm a technical writer by trade. So my whole thing is don't overwhelm the audience. Now, if you want to send monoku with punctuation to the journal, definitely consider it. But the workshop is focused on the 3-liners. Also, not only am I a technical writer, I am a little bit of a sociologist at heart. I find data fascinating. So I actually went and collected an assortment of 100 3-liners published in print and online from 2015 to 21. And I created some charts showing some trends. Now, this is not a statistically significant sample size. I'm just one person. I don't have a haiku data team, but it does reflect what I generally see in my reading of contemporary haiku. But again, I want to qualify, it's not statistically significant, but I thought 100 was a nice round number. So, punctuation for your haiku toolbox. First, yes, it can be a hot topic. Some haiku practitioners believe that that punctuation has no place in haiku. And in my own journey, I definitely, in my earlier haiku years, I did use punctuation. And then after someone said, you shouldn't do that, I'm also a very serious, trusting person. So I said, okay, then I won't do that. So for about 3 years, I didn't. But I'm also, I can't just not do something if I feel it's the right thing to do. And now this person, they meant well, and they had a reason for telling me not to use punctuation. And this person really believed that if the words were well chosen, the images were in the right order, then punctuation would not be necessary, and it would just make things too easy for the reader. But my reading of contemporary haiku in English shows me that a number of poets find value in punctuating their work, and I'm one of them. I've definitely gone back to it. So, thinking about the history of things. Now, many English language translators used what I call standard English language prose punctuation in their renditions of classic haiku. So things were structured as sort of a standard sentence with the commas where the commas would go, the periods where the periods would go. And early English language haiku poets such as Richard Wright also used standard English punctuation in their haiku. And in I think it was the last or second to last episode of series 4, Stanford M. Forrester has some thoughts on this. So you should definitely go back and listen to that. And in my own practice, I do still see English punctuation in haiku translations well into the 1990s, including from translators fluent in Japanese. And now, just a note, because I don't want anyone, I have my opinions and my thoughts, and I don't want anyone who loves their standard punctuation to feel ashamed of that or that they should not do it. If that is what you prefer in your haiku, go with it. Absolutely. These are, I don't want anyone to feel bad about the way they choose to write haiku. These are just reflections from my practice and my study. So, punctuation does have a bad rap. among some practitioners, and I think that a lot of that comes from the historical use of punctuation in translation. The more I read, the more I feel that punctuating haiku the way one would punctuate a standard English sentence, that does have a tendency to overwhelm such a short poem. Now, punctuation doesn't inherently make things too easy for the reader. It doesn't inherently overwhelm the text. But the punctuation of structures of English just often seem a little bit intrusive when you're thinking about a brief poem. And given the landscape of what I'm seeing in contemporary haiku, I think some poets find that standard English punctuation also looks a little outdated. And I think we can see this also reflected in translation. If we look at, for example, the same haiku in multiple translations, we can actually see a general tendency to reduce or eliminate that English punctuation over the course of 50 years or so. And of course, our reading habits, our teachers, our individual preferences, and the time and place in which we live, these all contribute to our poetic tendencies, including our likes and dislikes. Those of us who have come of age as writers in the last 20 or 30 years, we've written in an era where punctuation in haiku was becoming minimal or even non-existent. So for certain generations of readers and writers, heavy use of punctuation doesn't necessarily feel natural. So I'm going to actually show this with a series of translations, and these translations are approximations. They may be off by a year or two. Not all of the anthologies I have had reliable initial publication dates, so I just did my best. So forgive me, not intending to mislead anyone. It's just doing the best with what I have. So over here, we've got our good friend Blythe. The old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. Semicolon, M dash, period. So one punctuation in every line. And we've got Allen Ginsberg, roughly 1978. The old pond, a frog jumped in, kerplunk, comma and exclamation point. William J. Higginson, 1985. Old pond, a frog leaps in, water's sound. So just the ellipses. And then these last two have no punctuation. We've got Sam Hamill in 1995. At the ancient pond, a frog plunges into the sound of water. And Jane Reichold in 2002, old pond, a frog jumps into the sound of water. So and obviously translations all vary in many ways, but one of the things that I was interested was seeing how just the trend in punctuation did evolve. We could probably say some things about the capitalization too, but again, that's a whole nother topic. So what is the value of punctuation in haiku? Well, I think that deliberate and thoughtful use of punctuation can augment the sense of contrast or tension between images. And it's useful for guiding the reader to slow down or stop on the page. It can stand as a substitute for what would be conveyed by pauses or breath when reading out loud. And contemporary translators of Japanese haiku often use punctuation to stand in for the kireiji, or cutting word, which is a type of sound symbol that doesn't have an easy analog in English. And pardon my Japanese pronunciation, it's mediocre. So types of punctuation. I'm not going to go through every type of punctuation in the English language, although I could. But today I'm really thinking about pauses versus hard stops. So when we think of our pauses, we've got commas, semicolons, colons, and em dashes. And these different punctuation marks tend to cause different lengths of a pause. Commas tend to create the shortest ones and em dashes the longest. And contemporary English haiku does seem to favor pauses over hard stops. And there's a chart on that in a moment. When I say stops, I'm talking about our periods, exclamation points, question marks, the things we would use to end an independent clause or a longer sentence. So periods and exclamation points, these, when I read them, for me, they directly disrupt the flow of the poem, especially if they're in the first or second line. And the line breaks in haiku are a form of stop as well. And adding a period or exclamation point really can heighten that impact. A question mark also serves as an end stop, but I think it creates more of a sense of continued openness. And we'll see that in the example haiku I have in a little bit. So here's our first chart, punctuation tendencies. And the software wasn't entirely cooperating. So this light blue indicates commas, the medium blue is question marks. But out of 100 haiku, we have us English language haiku writers, we have this pretty solid preference for the em dash, and with ellipses not too far behind. Then colons, some people do like multiple types of punctuation. Some people like their exclamation points, commas, and a few with question marks. And here's an example. Before they were my daughters, wildflowers. It's Meredith Ackroyd from Frog Pond 44.3. I'll read it one more time. Before they were my daughters, wildflowers. If you're just listening to this on the podcast, it is an ellipses at the end of the second line. And that for me creates a pause that heightens the surprise of the final image. I remember when I first read this, I was not expecting wildflowers to be that third line. The pause extends and it really kind of softens the line break. The reader doesn't stop hard, but they can't rush onto the next line. It creates a sense of length in that second line without adding extra syllables. And actually in that way, punctuation can be a useful tool for those who really prefer minimalist haiku. So to keep it from feeling maybe a little too clipped. Another one. My hand takes them down the sledding hill, the legendary one. It's, Randy Brooks from the Ohio Haiku Anthology. My hand takes them down the sledding hill, the legendary one. So it's a comma at the end of the second line, and the slight pause gives the reader just an extra beat to pause, making the impact of the legendary one more dramatic. And my interpretation of the comma is that while it heightens the drama, it also creates a sense of intimacy. The pause seems conversational. I think it cultivates a sense of being in the know. Maybe that's because I'm from Ohio and I like to think I know which hill he's talking about. And in my reading of this haiku, the pause doesn't need to be dramatic because the presumed listener knows what the speaker is talking about. River Delta. My foster mom's fingers entwined with mine. Hifsa Asraf, Kingfisher 3. River Delta. My foster mom's fingers entwined with mine. It's an em dash at the end of the first line, and it creates a long pause, really leaving the reader anticipating what is to come. The connections and branchings of a river delta provide an image that heightens the image of foster mom and child holding hands. And a river delta can also evoke the image of veins on the back of a hand. And the river delta is, I think it's a less common association for family than a tree. And the fact that it is a fresh image makes that haiku extra compelling. The pause heightens the juxtaposition of the enjoined river and enjoined hands. And I did include a photo that's a river up in Alaska that I really liked. Just in case no one has ever seen one from above, I thought that would be useful. All right, another example with end stops. So this is from my friend Warren Decker. This has never been published. This came from our email correspondence. Be there then, click here now. Be there then, click here now. The first time I read that, I laughed so hard. The double exclamation point creates hard stops at the end of each line of this two-liner. And in this piece, Warren has created a senryu that illustrates the intensity of contemporary life, specifically with regard to rushing through the day and having a shortened attention span. The punctuation choice reinforces the sense of urgency, as well as the sense of satire that Warren brings to the poem. And I personally find that exclamation point often adds humor to the haiku. I don't think it has to, but I find if I'm consciously giving myself an exercise to write with exclamation points, I end up writing funnier ones, which is probably good for me. An empty homestead. How many pathways were there under all these weeds? Ayaz Daryl Nielsen, Cattails, April 2020. An empty homestead. How many pathways were there under all these weeds? Question marks do have a special quality of resolving a grammatical statement while also allowing for openness. And when I read this poem, I envision the vast expanse of a farmhouse surrounded by miles of agricultural fields, and the question mark accentuates that feeling of space. A question mark has a specific job, which is to create a sense of wonder. And when combined with well-honed lines and word choices, the punctuation brings the reader into the space of questioning, confusion, or contemplation. So now let's think about the placement of punctuation, because where we put our marks matters. So we can put them, within certain points in the line, the beginning, the middle, or the end. Punctuation at the end or the beginning slows the transition between images. And punctuation in the middle is rare. I was going through all my anthologies and I didn't find any to put in my survey, but I know it exists. I know I've seen it. I was just stuck on where I'd last seen any and couldn't find it. And contemporary haiku poets, we do tend to favor punctuation at the end of the line, as you can see. So this red slice indicates punctuation at the very beginning of a line, yellow in the middle. So I actually did find one, but that's just about it. But overwhelmingly, again, out of 100 haiku, virtually all had the punctuation at the end of the line. A couple had it in multiple spots, but there's a strong tendency for at the end. All right, and then which line do we choose? Punctuation in the first or second line, again, that can heighten the sense of juxtaposition between the two images, depending on how you've structured your poem. And punctuation in that third line can create a sense of closure in the case of a stop, or tension and mystery in the case of a pause. And again, in my reading experience, I see a trend toward placing punctuation in the first line with punctuation in the second line not too far behind. So in my survey of 100 haiku, again, nearly 64% of people had it in the first line, and then about 26% in the second line, some on multiple lines, and not many people putting it in the third line. So some examples: cricket weather, the first chirp of the smoke alarm. Angela Terry from Kingfisher 3. Cricket weather, the first chirp of the smoke alarm. So here we've got an M dash at the end of the first line. This makes us pause before we move into the second image. The pause invites us to slow down and think what cricket weather might entail. It's usually late summer or early fall, but can vary based on where you live. The pause makes the second image all the more compelling and humorous. And from a grammatical standpoint, putting the M dash at line 2, I don't think it would have worked as well. So I think that in terms of the way English works, that end of that first line really was the right choice. And again, this is another one that just made me laugh. 6 crows at the bus stop, southbound. Linda L. Ludwig, this was from Poetry P Journal, autumn 2021. 6 crows at the bus stop, southbound. we've got an em dash at the end of the first line and the beginning of the third line. And that pause creates a sense of mirroring. The double pause reinforces the two image, that of a southbound bus stop and that of birds preparing to fly south for winter. And by pausing twice, the reader is invited to sink into this haiku moment, the birds and an autumn urban landscape. The bus serves as a linchpin around which the first and third lines revolve. Just when I thought the day was gray, a blue jay swoops over the lilac. Doris Lynch, Poetry P Journal, Autumn 2021. Just when I thought the day was gray, a blue jay swoops over the lilac. So here we've got an em dash about 2/3 of the way through the second line. And that em dash within the second line makes the whole line feel complete, even with an enjambment between the second and third lines. Sometimes the use of enjambment in haiku can create an unhelpful sense of fragmentation. Again, I know there are people who just say don't use enjambment ever. I don't say you should never use it. I've definitely seen enjambment used skillfully, but it can create a sense of fragmentation that doesn't always work as well. But I think that em dash really helps avoid that issue. With the em dash, we also get the sudden appearance of the blue jay in the line. That line feels resolved, even though the thought isn't complete until the third line. And I think this is an example of a haiku in which punctuation can enhance other literary devices or techniques. Two brothers tear the sky from the lake. Fly fishing. Ava C. Cipri, Frog Pond 39.2. Two brothers tear the sky from the lake. Fly fishing. So here we have ellipses in the front of the third line. So the pause starts the line, and the punctuation location itself is a surprise. Again, we don't put a lot of punctuation at the start of the line. So it's a little unexpected just based on, I think, our implicit assumptions about where punctuation goes. And rather than pausing right at the end of the second line, we have to jump between the lines, then pause. The image, tear the sky from the lake, it's not an obvious one. And the ellipses allow the reader to savor the anticipation before getting that exclamation or explanation. Slowing my heartbeat to the river's speed, a patch of comfrey. Matthew Paul, Kingfisher 3. Slowing my heartbeat to the river's speed, a patch of comfrey. So in prose, a colon is used to draw a reader's attention to the information that follows. Here we've got a colon at the end of the second line. And in this haiku, the colon clearly draws our attention to the comfrey in the third line. We can't avoid it. And while one might feel that the use of the colon is heavy-handed, in my opinion, the use of the punctuation here emphasizes how much of an effect the comfrey had when Matthew Paul saw it. I feel like the colon is really emphasizing what a calming sight that comfrey is. And again, in case you've never seen comfrey, I know I haven't, we don't have them in Texas. At least I don't think we do. Seems like the wrong climate. So now I'm putting one of my haiku under the test. So I've got one haiku 3 ways. So the original, I have an em dash at the end of the first line. After a nightmare, hearing white-winged doves foreshadow sunrise. Variation 1 has a semicolon at the end of the line. After a nightmare, hearing white-winged doves foreshadow sunrise. Variation 2 has a comma. After a nightmare, hearing white-winged doves foreshadow sunrise. And I had the original, it didn't always, I actually think I wrote this one with no punctuation at the start, and then I added it because I deliberately wanted there to be a longer pause between those two images, of the jolt of waking from a nightmare and being sort of distressed and confused, and it's dark, and you're in that weird liminal space where you're like aware you've had a nightmare but you haven't come back yet, and then you realize, oh, daylight is coming. I can hear the birds starting to sing. I wrote this at my old house where there were just a ton of birds in the yard, and if I did wake up before sunrise, I would know that, you know, morning is almost here when I could hear the birds starting to sing. And in the other two variations, a semicolon creates, you know, it creates a good pause, but it's not visually as dramatic as the em dash, and so I don't think you end up pausing as well, as long, and you definitely don't with the comma. So for me, when I go back to it, I say, yes, that em dash was still the right choice, because I did want that dramatic pause and but I didn't want the hard stop. So I like the em dash still because it's most dramatic. So to conclude, some strategies for your haiku practice. First, break the rules. If you have been told that you shouldn't use a specific type of punctuation mark, give yourself permission to break the rules. Certainly, some of us have been told never use punctuation, but then there will be, even then there'll be people who are okay with punctuation, but not an exclamation point. The exclamation point has a pretty bad rap. So that was actually one of mine, was giving myself permission to use the exclamation point. And that's actually what I do in a live workshop. I make everyone draft haiku with an exclamation point because so many people think they shouldn't. And so we're just gonna get that over with. Also, experiment with location. Write different versions of the same haiku, observing what happens when you use punctuation in different places in the poem. How does, maybe try it in the first line and then in the second line, and what is the effect? Or experiment with the type of mark, which is what I did with my own poem. Write different versions of the same haiku, keeping your punctuation in the same place and observing what happens when you try different punctuation marks. So for me, trying the two other types of pause reinforced my decision that the em dash was the right one. And the goal of these exercises, this is not necessarily to write the best haiku of your life. I don't think that's what a writing exercise is for. To me, it's just to deliberately experiment with something. And in this case, we're going to be deliberately experimenting with punctuation in haiku and observing the results. And you might discover, you know, I really love exclamation points and I'm going to give myself permission. Or, you know, I had this haiku that wasn't working, but when I stick an em dash at the beginning of the second line, you know, it looks weird, but it's actually doing what I want it to do. And I love it. So you might find things you like, or you might say, you know what, I just never want to deal with periods in haiku ever. And that is okay as well. Again, we're observing our process and the results and how we feel about it. So that is the end.
Well, thank you very much, Allyson. I'm so pleased you put the question mark in there, because as I said to you before, I love a question mark. Don't write many myself with question marks, but I do love them. And I was really intrigued. I don't know American geography terribly well. So you have to tell me, you feel you know this hill in Randy's haiku. Has Ohio only got one hill?
No, it's just, you know, Ohio is a pretty big state, but now that I've lived in Texas, Ohio is not a big state, right? So, you know, there are a couple of hills in Ohio, but there's really just like 2 or 3 that are known as the really good ones. You know,
it's got to be one of them. Fair enough.
It's got to be one of those.
Okay, I was just intrigued.
Even if I don't know the exact one, it's, you know, I can guess.
Yeah. And then I had just a comment on the comfrey, because you don't know it. It grows here quite well, and it's for people with gardens. If you get load of comfrey and soak it in water and then filter the water off. It's very good fertilizer, natural fertilizer. Just there you are. And we'll do a gardening podcast one day.
Oh, that would be fun.
There you go. So the other thing I wanted to say is, what a shame Warren's poem isn't published, because it's a great, and the exclamation points, as I call them, they really make the poem, don't they? In that one.
They do. Well, and I got his permission to use it, so he was totally on board with it being on the podcast. He was pretty excited about it. So,
well, hopefully he'll listen and know how much I love it. But there you go. Good. Thank you very much. So I would just like to say that was a great presentation. And what I love about these workshops is not just that I learn stuff, but I get to hear haiku that maybe I've read before and maybe I haven't, but they come new to me, hearing it through another poet's voice. And I love that. And I love the examples you gave me. And I'm so pleased that you pointed out in the examples you gave where the punctuation was, because it hadn't occurred to me.
No, this is the thing I've been worried about ever since you took me up on my offer to talk about punctuation. I'm like, oh my God, but how are we going to do this on a podcast?
No. It's a good point that really hadn't occurred to me until you started pointing that out. I thought, oh, thank goodness one of us is switched on.
I just figured, I'm like, I can't be the only person who's had this problem, so it'll work out.
And it did.
I'm not going to let a little thing like lack of visual capacity stop me.
Excellent. That's what I like to hear. So Allyson, thank you very much. I know you're coming back on the podcast because you're going to actually be one of the community judges for this.
Yeah, I'm so excited for that.
So everyone, Allyson's coming back and she wants to see evidence that you've listened to her workshops. Let's get that punctuation going.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much
Thank
indeed,
you.
Allyson. Take care, and we'll see you again soon.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Thanks.